Hi there, friend. My name is John Werner. I used to be a part of the largest cult in the United States. After studying the Bible, Christian history, and ministry, I set my sights on confronting the problematic nature of white evangelicalism in the United States. In 2019, I published my first book as a first step in addressing the subtle issues of this complex system. This podcast will continue that work under the same title. Welcome to The Cult of Christianity. For those unfamiliar, apologetics is the fancy term for arguing in defense of your religion. In 2017, I had my preaching degree, but no church to call my own. I was youth pastoring, interning, doing things like that, and I was still arrogantly self-assured that I was a divinely appointed minister of truth. I convinced myself that I could reason anyone into Christianity. But somehow I couldn't quite convince people that I could convince people into Christianity. So I applied and was accepted into the Masters in Apologetics program at Liberty University. And thank whatever God you believe in that I didn't end up going. Because life throws you curveballs, sliders, splitters, fastballs, and knuckleballs, even a spitball every now and then. And the school kept hounding me to enroll, even after I had politely declined, due to me going through a divorce, homelessness, and a rather drunken deconstruction. Plus, around this time, some unsavory details were coming out about Liberty's leadership. And all of this made me question apologetics as a concept. See, there are different ways to argue for your religion. One approach could assume that you and the non-believer are on entirely different planets. Another might try to find common ground and convince you that you're practically a Christian already. There's strategies such as forget logic, just wait for that divine experience. You'll experience it. I'll pray for you. And I was good at all of these tactics, really good. I could spin arguments like a seasoned politician. But here's the thing. The more I dug in, the more I realized that these approaches were all a bit, shall we say, shaky. Arguing from experience, how do you argue someone into a religious experience? Saying we have common ground, well, it watered down Christianity to the point where Christianity didn't mean much anymore. And if you want to be super logical, it basically was saying that without Christianity, you're a worthless human. And I started to realize that I don't even believe that anymore. And look, debating religion can be a fun intellectual exercise, but ultimately the burden of proof isn't on the non-believer, it's on the one making the claims. And with faith, there aren't exactly a lot of hard facts on the table. And it's really hard to just argue hypotheticals all day. But cult leaders must cling to their alleged divine privilege of accessing absolute truth, shutting down any questions. They aren't interested in real debate, just converting people. Apologetics, in a way, does the same thing because it builds walls instead of bridges. In many ways, apologetics is the crux of all the flaws in Christianity. The position of apologetics is on defense. Every apologetics teacher at every Bible college and seminary will inform students on day one that apologetics does not argue that Christianity is provable. Instead, the entire point of apologetics is to assume Christianity is true and argue as if Christianity is a fact without technically proving or showing how it is a fact. And the best way to understand apologetics is to understand that it is all rhetoric and no substance. The training apologists go through, at least the ones who make it to debate stages in colleges or have their own podcast, is an exercise in shifting arguments, goalposts, and framings. The art of defending the imaginary requires never being pegged down and never being too definitive. But apologetics is a spectrum. Your average evangelical can parrot a thought-stopping cliche they heard from their pastor, or a congressman might cite defenders of a right-wing religious nationalism, and even brilliant minds at Ivy League institutions may indulge a nice-sounding step-by-step formula that justifies their faith in the Christian God. Have you ever had a deep conversation with a friend about life, the universe, everything? Maybe it touched on religion, and a Christian friend started framing the universe in intriguing terms. Well, think of apologetics as a well-stocked backpack for somewhat intellectual tools of faith. It's packed with arguments and reasoning that help you defend the Christian belief. It's not about a street preaching fire and brimstone, browbeating people into conversion, but rather presenting a seemingly well-reasoned case for Christ. Many Christians are indoctrinated that it is their responsibility to share their beliefs with the world. It's easy because they believe they have made this profound discovery, and so of course they want to tell everyone about it. Well, apologetics gives them a certain kind of language and equips them to do that in a rather persuasive way. And if the person they are defending their faith to is rather passive and not super critical, it may indeed result in a convert. There are arguments based on logic and philosophy, what they believe to be evidence from the Bible, and most often personal experiences of faith. The idea is to choose the right argument for the job, depending on who you're talking to and what resonates with them. While apologetics can involve intellectual debates, it's not really about winning arguments. It's more about making unbelievable claims sound more palatable. Even if someone ultimately disagrees, just moving the needle towards acceptability is enough. Think of it as a conversation starter, a way to open doors to other tactics that the cult possesses. And Christian apologetics equips believers to explain and defend their faith in a thoughtful way. It's about that backpack full of reasons, ready to be unpacked and shared with those who are curious or maybe skeptical. But so much of what they spout is misinformation, disinformation, and slippery rhetoric. At its core, Christian apologetics is a pseudo-intellectual exercise. It cherry-picks arguments and interpretations, often clashing with established scientific evidence, historical context, and tenets of logic. It's like trying to build a fortress with sandcastles. The arguments crumble under waves of critical thinking. Furthermore, the content of this supposed intellectual arsenal raises concerns. Apologetic arguments rely on interpretations of the Bible that are demonstrably out of touch with modern social realities and scholarship. These interpretations perpetuate toxic ideas, particularly regarding gender roles and social structures. This focus on outdated norms leaves many ostracized and reinforces a patriarchal power dynamic within the faith. This isn't to say that any discussions about faith are inherently flawed. On the contrary, exploring the complexities of faith, religion, philosophy with a critical lens can be a deeply enriching experience, and imagination is not off the table. But Christian apologetics, with its focus on pre-packaged arguments and intellectual one-upsmanship, ultimately hinders any genuine exploration of faith. But these tactics are not a recent development. Apologetics has been a cornerstone of religious discourse for millennia. Its history is rather fascinating. It's a tapestry woven with philosophy, cultural clashes, and the search for ultimate truth. The historical context of apologetics. The seeds of apologetics were sown in the fertile ground of the early Christian church. Surrounded by a dominant Roman Empire steeped in polytheism, Christians found themselves needing to defend their monotheistic faith. The first apologists, figures like Justin Martyr, that should be a famous name to you, and Tertullian, tackled accusations of atheism and immorality leveled against the Christians. This was a real thing happening. People thought Christians were atheists because they didn't believe in as many gods. They also believed that their human was a god. Thus, the argument was they must be atheists. But instead, these apologists argued for the moral superiority of Christianity and its fulfillment of Jewish prophecies. A prominent theologian back in that day, Origen, who was later deemed a heretic, emphasized the role of the Holy Spirit in Christian belief, offering a more experiential defense of the faith. And then if you fast forward to the rise of scholasticism in the Middle Ages, it marked a new chapter in apologetics because you had Thomas Aquinas, a towering figure in Catholic theology, who was seeking to reconcile this faith versus reason tension. He employed some amount of logic and philosophical arguments to demonstrate the compatibility of Christian doctrines with the natural world. This period also saw apologetics address the growing influence of Islam, with theologians like Anselm of Canterbury engaging in theological debates. And much later, you have the Protestant Reformation, which fueled apologetic endeavors as both Catholics and Protestants defended their theological positions. So now it's not just arguing with non-Christians. Apologetics would now be a Christian-to-Christian battle as well. And the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and scientific inquiry, posed a fresh set of challenges for religious belief. Apologetics had to adapt to address concerns about the compatibility of faith and science. And so thinkers like Joseph Butler argued for the reasonableness of Christianity, while William Paley's famous watchmaker analogy highlighted the idea of a designer behind the intricate design of the universe. The historical reliability of the Bible also came under quite a bit of scrutiny during this time, and that prompted apologists to defend the Gospels and the early spread of Christianity, often just spewing mis- and disinformation. And today's world presents a complex and diverse landscape for apologetics. C.S. Lewis, with his accessible writing style and focus on the human experience, has likely been the most influential rhetorician, speaker, thinker for the 20th century as far as Christianity is concerned. And figures like William Lane Craig and now the deceased and disgraced Ravi Zacharias, they're prominent examples of contemporary apologists known for being experts in philosophical arguments for the existence of a god. Apologetics now not only addresses atheism, but also grapples with issues like religious pluralism and the problem of evil. Apologetics serves as a vital role for Christianity and has throughout history. It's evolved alongside cultural and intellectual shifts, adapting its arguments to address the changing needs of the time. As the world continues to evolve, apologetics will undoubtedly adapt to the ongoing conversation about faith, reason, and the meaning of existence. The idea of defending one's faith seems actually fairly essential, but it's not. You don't have to actually have these esoteric arguments to explain yourself and how you feel and what you imagine. But if you must defend the Christian faith, there are generally 3 to 4 types of apologetics, at least according to my apologetics professor back in the day when I took the class. And different approaches cater to various audiences and tackle questions of faith from distinct angles. The 4 major types of apologetics are classical, evidential, which is similar to classical, presuppositional, and experiential, each offering a unique lens through which to view and defend the Christian faith. And standing on the shoulders of ancient philosophers, classical apologetics builds a bridge between reason and faith. It utilizes arguments like the cosmological argument, which argues for a first cause from the existence of the universe, the teleological argument, which is about finding evidence of design in nature, and the ontological argument, which proposes the inherent existence of God based on the concept of a perfect being. And this approach emphasizes natural theology, the idea that God's existence can be understood through reason alone without relying on any kind of special revelation or the Bible. So let me give you an example of how this type of apologetics works. A cosmological argument might sound something like this. Have you ever looked at the night sky with all its stars and planets and wondered, how did it all get there? Well, just like a super complex machine needs someone to build it, the universe must have a builder too. The universe is just way too massive and orderly to have popped into existence by accident. There must be purpose and a powerful cause behind this all. And that cause, I believe, is what many people call God. So that's kind of how that argument goes. Then you have a teleological argument, which sounds something like this. Think about all the amazing things in nature, like the way a bird's wing is perfectly shaped for flying, or how a flower attracts bees to help it reproduce. These things must be designed with a purpose, just like how those parts of a machine work together. This points to a designer of some kind behind nature, someone who planned this all out. And this designer could be the same one who created the universe in the first place. So that's that argument. And then there's also the ontological argument, probably the weakest one. But it goes like this. Imagine the most perfect thing you can possibly think of. Think about it. Just imagine perfection. Wouldn't something that perfect have to actually exist in reality? If you can imagine something so perfect with all the best qualities, then it must be real. And that perfect being must be God. So as you can see, these arguments work best step by step to build a case. But realistically, it sounds more like a lawyer arguing against evidence rather than for evidence. And for those seeking a more empirical approach, you might be more gravitating towards a evidential apologetics. It talks about the historical facts and what is verifiable in order to bolster the case for Christianity. And this method often focuses on defending the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which is obviously a foundational tenet of Christianity. The reliability of the Bible and its historical accuracy are also scrutinized, with proponents highlighting the archaeological finds and corroborating historical records. So the big focus of evidential apologetics is often the life of Jesus Christ, especially the idea that he rose from the dead after being crucified. And obviously that's a super important belief. They will cite extra biblical literature and cite how the majority of scholarship acknowledges Jesus likely did exist. But the leaps of logic abound in this style, and it is often combined with classical apologetics in order to appear stronger than it is. Another style, and this was my preferred style, I used it as a shield when I was a Christian, is presuppositional apologetics, which goes beyond traditional arguments and challenges the very foundation of non-Christian worldviews. It argues that all forms of logic and knowledge ultimately presuppose the existence of God, and proponents believe that human reason by its very nature points to a divine source. And this approach emphasizes the limitations of human reason without faith and claims that the Christian faith provides the only valid basis for rational thought. And so this type of defense is a bit like starting a game with a different set of rules. Presuppositional apologists say that everyone already has some ideas built into their brain. And those ideas are like the basic rules of a game, and they're just different if you're Christian or you're not. These ideas might be about right and wrong, how the world works, and presuppositional apologetics argues that these basic ideas actually come from God, even if people don't realize it. And this approach says that without believing in God, it's impossible to truly understand anything or have any good reasons for your belief. In other words, they believe that faith in God is the only way to really think clearly. And this method of apologetics is very effective for a number of reasons. The main one is that if I can argue that we're experiencing the same reality, whether you like it or not, mine is just better because I'm right. Well, you can't argue that. It's like how food tastes better when you're high or drunk. Life is just better when you do it with Jesus. Well, how will they know if they don't give it a shot? And that's why the next form of apologetics that I'm going to talk about couples well with presuppositional, because the most compelling arguments are rarely rooted in logic or evidence, but in personal experience. And that's what experiential apologetics is all about. Experiential apologetics draws strength from individual stories of transformation and encounters with the divine. Believers share their personal testimonies, highlighting how faith has impacted their lives and provided meaning. And this approach emphasizes the subjective validation of faith, appealing to those who seek a more personal connection with the divine. So if you imagine you're trying to convince a friend of a movie you love, you could tell them all the awards it's won and why critics like it. But sometimes the most convincing thing is to just tell them how much you enjoyed the movie or how you related to it. The experiential approach is for people who connect more with personal stories rather than a list of facts and numbers. And each of these apologetic methods offers unique talking points for defending religious faith. Classical apologetics provides a philosophical framework. Evidential apologetics strengthens the case with historical evidence. Presuppositional apologetics challenges opposing worldviews, and experiential apologetics connects with the power of personal stories. The choice of approach depends on the audience and the specific questions being addressed. And let me highlight how this works in practicality by explaining this group presentation I co-wrote with my other Bible college peers, showing how different methods could be used to defend a Christian worldview on anything at all. And we chose to use fine art as our illustration. And so first, we had to define art in the driest of terms possible and present them as a fact so fundamental it is beyond criticism. And this is the crucial first step. So listen up. This is the crucial first step in manipulation that often gets overlooked. So in this group presentation for my apologetics class, we defined art as the conscious production or arrangement of sounds, colors, forms, movements, or other elements in a manner that affects the sense of beauty. And while that sounds like a fairly basic dictionary definition, the point is not to agree on words, but rather lure a captive audience into a false sense of intellectual pursuit. It's a fine definition of art, but it's also loaded with assumptions. Why does art have to be consciously produced or arranged? Is life art? How has art been defined throughout history? Why are we accepting this definition automatically? But I digress. We weren't even really trying to argue for a Christian perspective on art, but rather fine art, which we defined as, quote, art that expresses a thought or feeling, uses skill in its respective medium, and is created for a purpose. And where did we get that definition? We made it up. Now, I love making up definitions more than the next guy. I still do it. Hell, even how I define cults is somewhat made up. Now, granted, when I say cults control, contain, convert, it's still based on observation. And our definition for fine art was probably based on some amount of observation, but it definitely had a bias and perspective. Because the point of us defining fine art with those particular words is a bit more about proselytization than it appears. Because by saying that fine art must be expressive, we are saying that it must be clear. We're also saying there must be skill, which is simply untrue. I mean, unskilled art is just that. Bad fine art and unskilled fine art exist. It's still fine art. We were saying if it is not skilled or it's not expressive, then it mustn't be art. And that alone is a no true Scotsman fallacy. And of course, Christians love that fallacy more than anything. Well, they're not a real Christian. Well, that's not real art. It's a weak argument, and it's in fact a fallacy. But the most egregious thing we said in our definition is that fine art must be created for a purpose. I mean, I don't believe that at all. You can create fine art purposelessly. Or there might be some purpose, but it certainly doesn't have to be a profound purpose. But it sounds so convincing when you state it in dictionary-like language. And I'm still on our definitions. I haven't even begun to scrutinize what our presentation looked like and how our presentation was really about defending the Christian perspective on fine art. I'm just dissecting the definitions we gave, but it's important to take some time here because Christian apologetics hopes that you won't scrutinize its carefully crafted definitions. At surface, our definitions there seemed fine. They seemed almost universal, but they aren't. And often Christians rely on very westernized, oversimplified, and three-tiered definitions to make their arguments seem more palatable to the everyman. And this is a common practice just in pseudo-intellectualism and at large. And the pseudo-intellectualism doesn't start when the rhetoric is being built. They want you to stop being critical before the arguments even begin, accept their definitions without scrutiny. So always, please always, if you take nothing else away from this episode, listen here. Pay attention to how Christians define things. And in our presentation, we rambled on about the history of art in the Bible and what different theologians had said about art. And we gave the class something to think about by showing how Christian history has actually been anti-fine art in theology and practicality. And, there's some good stuff in our presentation. But when we got to the crux of the issue, it was how to see fine art through a Christian lens and how to defend that perspective. And we went through each method, right? If one wants to use the emotive language of experiential apologetics, one could say that art stirs in us emotions. It's a chemical response and it is involuntary. There's, of course, a danger of over-emotionalism, void of true worship of the one true living God. But emotions are natural and should be embraced when praising God. Art is at its best when used to glorify our Creator. And let me tell you about this worship experience I had, or let me segue this into my testimony. That's one way you could use fine art in experiential apologetics. If one wanted to use a more evidential approach, you could say that the existence of beauty alone is indicative of something meaningful. While many see beauty as a subjective feeling or sentiment occurring in the mind with no objective value other than itself, Christians have the honor and have long known that it is objectively beautiful if there is some ordinate degree of aesthetic pleasure that attaches to a piece of art. In other words, beauty is evidence of goodness. And logically, the thought that those who create beautiful things means that they themselves have some level of beauty. Perhaps those who design things must also be designed. Sounds pretty good, right? Are you finding yourself swayed a little bit? But, my favorite method was presuppositional. So if one, like me, wanted to take a presuppositional approach, one could say that art needs God. The way I would put it is something like, fine art can have no true objective standard without the truth of God as its measure. However, God's mercy still allows for subjective expression within art. God's power provides the only true way to enjoy art to the fullest. You see, by that argument, I don't actually deny people's subjective experiences or the value that they themselves may place on something. I simply say, you can't enjoy it as much as I can. And isn't that so titillating? And there's more fluff you can add to any one of these types of arguments. For example, the big idea of our apologetics presentation was art brings beautiful good in a world full of ugly evil. Can't you just hear a preacher saying that? Art brings beautiful good in a world of ugly evil. Our Christian influence should be one of hope, one of courage. Art gives us a chance to express that hope and courage through different creative mediums, causing thought and intrigue into the minds of those observing the piece. So just to recap, the trick is to start with a sacred presumption, a non-negotiable definition. Once you've done that and lured people away from their critical thinking, you argue how Christianity is either the only way that these things could exist, or at least that Christianity is the way its existence makes the most sense, or is the most enjoyable. And that's the essence of the game, hidden amongst truisms, similes, and half-assed summaries of alternative history and unearned appeals to authority from some theologians of yesteryear, are logically flawed and fundamentally nonsensical arguments that everything I believe is perfectly reasonable. While apologetics is presented as a robust intellectual defense of Christian beliefs, a closer look reveals it to be a pseudo-intellectual exercise that shields faith from the challenges of reality. From the Greek word apologia, meaning defense, apologetics aims to provide rational justification for Christian beliefs, particularly in the face of skepticism or competing worldviews. Its goals include demonstrating the existence of God, the validity of Scripture, and the historical accuracy of a Christian perspective on events. But it talks so little about any of those things. And deep down, I believe that the loudest apologists understand that any attempts to defend a belief system that often contradicts established scientific facts and historical understandings would be fruitless. It doesn't actually defend the belief system. And despite its claims of intellectual rigor, Christian apologetics fall prey to several pitfalls that undermine its legitimacy. Apologetics falls into the category of circular arguments, where they use the Bible itself as evidence for the Bible's truth. And that kind of closed system avoids a genuine engagement with their perspective. They also deal in unhinged confirmation bias, where they only look at information that confirms their existing beliefs while disregarding that which contradicts them. Apologetics employs tactics more akin to propaganda than intellectual discourse. Selective use of evidence, circular reasoning that confirms existing beliefs, and an emphasis on emotional appeals that exploit fear, guilt, and the need for social belonging. That's the hallmark of their approach. This fosters an us versus them mentality, isolating believers from critical perspectives and potentially creating very cult-like loyalty to a preordained conclusion. Apologetics rarely, if ever, actually engages with genuine questions or grapples with the complexities of the modern world. Apologetics shuts down actual dialogue between faith and reason, assuming that reason is actually more limited than faith, rather than the other way around. And Christians use apologetics to perpetuate a curated version of reality. And Christianity, in general, thrives on self-insulation and fears that critical examination of their faith ultimately weakens the very beliefs that apologists seek to defend. Professional apologetics is akin to grifting. While apologists are pitched as supposed intellectual bodyguards of faith, they do not champion reason at all. And a closer examination reveals a practice more like the fable of the emperor's new clothes, a parade of dazzling arguments that, upon closer inspection, conceal a troubling lack of evidence, and also a lack of substance. Apologetics, in its current form, fosters a dangerous denial of reality, promoting a worldview that clashes with critical thinking. The most glaring issues lie in the realm of science. Many apologists engage in a baffling dance with established scientific principles. Evolutionary theory, the cornerstone of modern biology, is often dismissed as mere conjecture, replaced with creationist narratives or the equally dubious notion of intelligent design. Even if evolution is acknowledged, its definition must be adjusted constantly in order to fit the narrative that Christians want. And this cherry picking of evidence extends to climate science, with the large majority of Christian apologists downplaying the very real threat of human-induced environmental change. History, too, becomes a battleground in the hands of apologists. Historical events and figures are twisted to fit a preordained narrative. The brutal realities of the Crusades or the Inquisition are downplayed or dismissed or not known about. They're just talked about like complicated eras of history. This revisionist approach not only whitewashes the past, but also undermines the very intellectual honesty apologists think they uphold. And even if an apologist admits that Christians have acted wrong in the past, they will never, ever acknowledge that this was the result of their faith. In fact, maybe these weren't real Christians at all. Gotta go to the old reliable no Scotsman fallacy. And the most concerning aspect of apologetics lies in its potential for psychological manipulation. Apologists encourage blind leaps of faith and logic, prioritizing the importance of unwavering belief over critical thinking. The promotion of absolute truth claims and moral infallibility further just isolates the believers who are listening to these apologists, creating an echo chamber where dissent is stifled and intellectual growth stagnates. And the true strength of any belief system lies in its ability to withstand scrutiny, which, give credit where credit is due, Christians have been scrutinized for a long time. And that's because they do evolve in the face of new evidence, just never too much. And contemporary apologists resemble children plugging their ears and shouting, la, 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 hoping to drown out the inconvenient truths of reality. Because now their beliefs thrive on a very carefully constructed illusion, a faith that fears open dialogue and withers under the harsh light of reason, ultimately weakening the argument for the beliefs they are defending. Another red flag of apologetics in general is just that it's a fucking boys' club. While I've seen more and more problematic women breaking the glass ceiling of rhetorical jujitsu, it is still indelibly patriarchal to gaslight the masses using pseudo-intellectualism. For centuries, Christian apologetics has been a domain dominated by men. This male supremacy has fostered a culture rife with toxic masculinity, pushing a narrow definition of what it means to be a Christian leader. The roots of this problem lie in patriarchy. The historical dominance of male apologists has regulated women to the sidelines of theological discourse. This not only silences valuable and often more empathetic perspectives, but also creates a feedback loop where masculinity becomes the default for religious authority. And this dominance manifests in the language used by apologists. Metaphors of war, spiritual warfare being a prime example, paint faith as a battlefield where aggression is a virtue. The act of defending faith becomes synonymous with masculine strength, further marginalizing those who don't fit this mold. And the emphasis on control and authority is another red flag. Many apologetic circles prioritize male leadership within the church, often suppressing dissent and critical voices, especially those from women. And that alone creates an environment where questioning or offering alternative viewpoints is seen as weakness and further reinforces the toxic masculine ideal of conformity. And a reminder, I used to be all about apologetics. I used to be all about defending my faith. I almost made apologetics my master's, convinced that I could reason anyone into Christianity. And sure, apologetics comes in different flavors, each with its own strategy. Some rely on logic and philosophy, others on what they think is historical evidence. There's also the very powerful messaging of personal experiences, or even just challenging the very foundation of what your average non-Christian believes. But the problem is that the arguments Christians choose crumble under any real scrutiny. Beyond just cherry picking evidence using circular reasoning and relying on logical fallacies, the whole point of apologetics is not to ascertain truth, but to make Christianity seem more credible than it is. It's like how magicians pull off their tricks. Apologists distract you with fancy rhetoric and sleight of hand while hiding the lack of substance behind their performance. They focus on information that confirms their belief and dismiss anything that could possibly contradict them. And that isolation from critical thinking that believers expose themselves to when they listen to apologists fosters a dangerous denial of reality. It's all just to protect a very carefully constructed illusion of faith that withers under critical examination. Apologetics reinforces a narrow definition of religious leadership and silences valuable perspectives, especially those from women. But here's the big problem with apologetics. Apologetics is just cultic rhetoric. That's all apologetics is. Cultic rhetoric and religious apologetics share a deep reliance on appeals to authority. In cults, this authority often takes the form of a charismatic leader whose words are treated as the ultimate truth. Followers cling to these pronouncements with fanatical fervor. And religious apologetics, though cloaked in the respectability of tradition and scholarship, functions in the exact same way. Sacred texts and the interpretations of recognized theologians serves as the bedrock for their argumentation, their authority that should be unquestioned by the faithful. Whether it is the Bible, the Quran, the latest revelation from a self-styled prophet out in California, the source of authority is immaterial to how it functions as infallible truth. Personal testimonies are another common thread. In cults, the personal transformation stories of members are paraded as evidence of the group's power and legitimacy. These narratives recount dramatic shifts from despair to fulfillment, from lost soul to enlightened being, thanks to the intervention of the cult or the cult leader. Apologetics, with a veneer of sophistication, employs conversion stories and miracle accounts in the exact same way. The personal experience becomes irrefutable proof of divine intervention or of spiritual truth, shielding these claims from any critical scrutiny. If you pitch the faith as essential to one's identity, you become bigoted in your critiques of the faith. It's a firewall and a deeply destructive fallacy. And you'll see the creation of an us versus them dichotomy in both cults and in religious rhetoric. Cults often position themselves as the sole possessors of truth in a world filled with delusion and deception. They try to foster a sense of exclusivity and heighten the group cohesion, essential for maintaining control over members. Christianity, even the kinds that may preach tolerance or inclusivity, it also delineates clear boundaries between the saved and the damned, the faithful and the heretical. And that division reinforces a strong group identity and discourages defection or dissent. Apologetics frames these divisions as justified and eternally sanctioned. Take it up with my boss type of kicking the can. But ultimately, this rhetoric just borders on fascism light. Fear of damnation, the promise of eternal joy, the guilt of sin, and the hope of redemption are emotions expertly manipulated to bind adherents to any group. I mean, cults often leverage intense emotional experiences during initiation rituals or communal gatherings to create a sense of belonging and transcendence. And similarly, Christian services and rituals are designed to evoke profound emotional responses, reaffirming the believer's commitment to the faith. Spiritual or doctrinal justification is a cornerstone in both cults and religions. Cults might present novel revelations or reinterpret existing scripture to suit their needs, but the established religions rely on centuries of theological scholarship, some obscure, some foundational, most misquoted or reimagined, all to defend their doctrines. The differences in content are superficial. The underlying mechanism is identical. Whether it's a big religion or a small cult, both use revered texts to validate their beliefs and practices, usually bending interpretations just to fit a very specific worldview that benefits the cult leader of that group. While cult leaders might predict imminent apocalyptic events to spur urgency among their followers, mainstream religions have embedded eschatological visions within their sacred texts and theologies. The end times, whether they are forecasted for next Tuesday or some indefinite point in the future, provide a powerful narrative that can be used to motivate and control adherents, using fear and anxiety about the world to create a comforting or cathartic narrative. The thing is, both Christianity and cults impose moral codes on followers and claim that it's divine or a transcendent origin for these codes of behavior. And those moral imperatives serve to regulate behavior and reinforce the group's ideological framework. Whether through the Ten Commandments or the edicts of a modern-day Messiah, the function remains the same: to provide a clear, unchallengeable standard of conduct that binds the group together. The distinction between cults and religions most often merely hinges on social perception and power dynamics rather than on substantive differences in belief or practice. Religions that achieve a certain level of social acceptance and historical longevity are regarded as legitimate, while newer or smaller groups are more likely to be labeled as cults. This mainstream acceptance is often a function of political and economic influence. Established religions yield significant political and economic power, which helps them maintain their legitimacy and avoid the cult label. They are entrenched within the societal fabric, benefiting from legal protections and privileges not offered to groups more easily spotted as cults. But Christian apologetics is cultic. It utilizes manipulative strategies to persuade and retain members, claims exclusive access to truth, and fosters toxic environments of self-soothing and isolation. Now, Christians will tell you that faith and reason can walk hand in hand. But that harmony is never natural. Faith, true faith, is really a slap in the face to reason. Because faith is that fire in your belly, that feeling that lifts you up from the dusty floor and whispers of a glory beyond all earthly reckonings. You can't measure faith with facts and figures. You can't pin it down with fancy arguments. Spirituality should be an experience of freedom. But apologetics, that tidy tool of defense, tries to tame and leash spirituality with logic. But a tamed God ain't much of a God, is he? A God comfortable with a white lie, a crutch for the timid soul. Because apologetics wants answers. It wants to appear to win arguments, or at least make the faith more palatable. It wants to prove your patch of holiness is the only one and the only true one. But the real questions, the ones that sear your soul, those questions don't have easy answers. Spirituality in silence is powerful. And if any faith is to be respected, it's the one that knows how little it knows. But the sinister point of Christian apologetics is an effort to control and contain and convert individuals, shaping not their beliefs, but their very identities and actions. The whole aim of apologetics is to control the narrative around religions, especially Christianity, and moral truths. By asserting that Christianity holds the ultimate truth, apologists can exert influence over followers' worldviews without proving or even reasoning through a damn thing. And this control extends beyond mere belief. It encompasses moral and ethical behaviors, social norms, and even political stances. The implication is that deviating from these prescribed norms is not just wrong, but sinful. It ruins your relationship with Christ. This is effectively controlling individuals through fear of eternal consequences and using somewhat smart-sounding rhetoric to make it all seem not so bad. Apologists work hard to contain alternative viewpoints and dissent within the boundaries of doctrinal orthodoxy. And that kind of containment is achieved through arguments designed to discredit other religions, other philosophies, and scientific explanations that challenge Christian teachings. This focus on creating an environment where questioning or doubting the faith is discouraged. And no, we have these reasonable arguments. They might even outright condemn you not having an answer for what you believe without giving you an answer for what to believe. This all keeps adherents within the fold, hoping eventually they're going to learn the right words or the right answers to stop their head from spinning. This all just limits people's exposure to potentially conflicting ideas. And it all reinforces a homogeneous belief system. Your average Christians feel that the intellectual work has been done and has solved their questions. Even if they can't quite articulate it well themselves, some apologist somewhere out there has already figured this out. At its core, Christian apologetics is about conversion. They will say it's not, but they are lying. Apologists use arguments and evidence to weakly persuade non-believers to adopt the Christian faith. But because that's so rarely effective, they must act as though the apologetics is something else. Because this process of conversion is not really about changing one's religious identifications. It involves justifying countercultural values, behaviors, and affiliations, and widening the scope of permissible viewpoints. This is all to make Christian beliefs seem less silly. The ultimate goal is to expand the influence of Christianity by bringing more individuals into the faith, thereby increasing the control and containment efforts over a larger population. The sinister nature of Christian apologetics lies in its strategic and systematic approach to influencing individuals' lives. Apologetics is a tool for maintaining and expanding religious power. This power is used not for spiritual guidance, but to enforce conformity and suppress dissent, ensuring that the apologists and their institutions remain authoritative and unchallenged. While the practitioners of Christian apologetics genuinely believe that they are spreading truth, or at least I think they do, they think they're providing guidance for a fulfilling life. But the underlying tactics are inherently manipulative and coercive. By asserting ultimate truth is found in Christianity, they can shape people's beliefs, they can limit dissent, and they can expand their influence. Christian apologetics prioritizes religious dominance over individual people's personal freedom. Apologetics defends the indefensible and only offers proof that Christianity is as empty as the rhetoric it chooses to employ. This is the final season of The Cult of Christianity, but this is not the last time I will be investigating religions and cults. If you'd like to continue to follow my work, go to jverner.com or follow my Substack at johnverner.substack.com. You can also continue to support my work by going to thecultofchristianity.com and subscribing for a giant backlog of bonus content and stay up to date when my next big project releases. Thank you for listening, subscribing, sharing, reviewing, and as always, keep love in your life, hope in your heart, and searching in your soul.